Hi guys! So what I want to talk to you about today is something that has been rearing its head in pretty much all of the videos that I've been making over the past maybe year or more since this has become an issue for me. And that of course is the so-called spiritual slump, the infamous spiritual slump, which I think is something that in this community we talk about a lot. It is a problem for us a lot, and there are kind of reasons for that. And honestly, I personally can't get enough of hearing people's ideas about this and their tips and how they've dealt with it and so on. So I thought that I might actually make a dedicated video focusing on this. This is not to say that I have solved this completely for myself. This is the be-all and the end-all of the spiritual slump. This is just me having made a certain amount of progress and wanting to share with you how it is that I've gotten to that point now that I can kind of look back on it and reflect. Before I get started though, I'm just going to mention really quickly, because this is the first time you're going to be seeing this in a video, and the artwork you can see behind me on the altar. This is a new print that I'm absolutely in love with. It's by an artist called Audra Auclair. I'll link her down below. I'll link her YouTube channel and probably her Instagram account as well. She's a wonderful Canadian artist whom I really love, and I've been wanting a print from her for a long time, and then this print just jumped out at me. It's so goddess to me. So I'm really excited to have that on my altar, and I'll be talking about that again later in the video because it all plays into how I've helped myself lift out of this slump. And it's kind of ushering in a new era for me, I think, in my spiritual practice. At least that's what I'm hoping. So I think primarily when you feel as though you have entered a spiritual slump, when you have that realization, I think the first thing that we kind of need to do, and this is what I realized I needed to do, is to enter into a dialogue with yourself about that, to get really honest about it and actually think and talk and write about it, and not try to just shy away from it through panic, or just to busy yourself with other things, or to try to busy yourself with your practice. Once you realize that you're experiencing something that for you feels like a spiritual slump, yeah, you need to get into dialogue with yourself. And I think the two main things, the two main approaches that have been helpful for me, and which are kind of self-evident really in that dialogue, in an approach to that dialogue, is a lot of kindness and a lot of honesty. So I kind of mentioned the kindness issue first. There's absolutely no point in beating yourself up about this. I think a lot of us have come from religious backgrounds where there was an obligation towards our spiritual practice, and we come into, whether it's a pagan spirituality or something else, something just magic based, something, whatever it is, whatever spiritual path it is that you're on, whatever it is that has brought you to my channel, whatever it is that we have in common, I think we do bring a lot of that mentality to it, and a lot of the conversation about religion is around this kind of sense of obligation and the laws and the dogma and all of that. And while we kind of, in this community, in this kind of alternative spiritual community, while we like to shy away from that sense of dogma and to very much posit ourselves as our own authority, at the end of the day we do carry with us that sense of obligation, and whether it is through dedicating ourselves to specific gods or just dedicating ourselves to really what is a very vigorous practice. If you're following the pagan wheel of the year, and if you're also celebrating full moons and maybe even dark moons as well, that's a lot of self-directed practice. And you might think to yourself, well, you know, a lot of, you know, the Abrahamic religions, for example, they all go to some sort of worship at least once a week, and never mind all the prayers at home and all of that. And that is true. Like, it is kind of that kind of structural, routine practice is part and parcel of a lot of those traditional religions that have been kind of a part of our cultural upbringing maybe. But when it's completely self-directed, I think it takes an awful lot more emotional, mental and even physical energy to carry out that practice, because it's not passive. It's not as simple as knowing what it is that you're supposed to do, knowing what prayers you're supposed to say at a specific time of the day, or whether it's the rosary, or whether you're going to mass, going to church, going to worship. You know, there are very set structures, and if you identify with that faith and you are part of that religious practice, that is kind of laid down for you. And a lot of us are in this milieu, for want of a better word, because we don't like that, because we don't like being told necessarily what to do. We want to have a spiritual self-expression that is more fluid and is more unique to us, and that feels more open and free. But that requires more energy. It requires a lot more work. And I think the first thing to do when you realise that it's not happening for you right now, that it's feeling stale, or that you're not actually, you know, upholding those commitments, is to be kind to yourself and remember really just how much energy goes into this. And remember that when you started off on your path, it was probably something akin to, you know, when you have like a brand new hobby and you're really, really into it. It's almost kind of like having a crush, that you have that rush that you can't wait to go home and get started and, you know, take out the crystals, light the candles, whip out your tarot deck, whatever it is. You know, you're really, really excited about it. And after a while, once it becomes kind of routine and once the novelty wears off, it does become more and more of a chore. It becomes more of a drain on your time and your resources, because you don't have that initial sort of burst of novelty, that excitement that comes with that kind of novelty. And that's okay. And if this means that you end up dropping certain things, you know, after a while of your practice, then that's okay. But I think, yeah, primarily the thing I want to say is you are doing this for yourself and yourself alone. And if for some reason you are feeling burned out and you're really not feeling the joy of it anymore, and you're beating yourself up about that, well then stop. Because at the end of the day, you are doing this in order to be a happier, more connected, more reverent version of yourself. And beating yourself up about not upholding certain patterns or habits that you have picked up in the past or committed to in the past is really not helping you achieve that aim at all. So yeah, don't do it. And it's easier said than done, I do realise that. And then kind of connected to that, I would say, and this is kind of moving more towards the being honest with yourself, which is going to be a large kind of part of what this video is about. I would say to think about, be really honest about whether or not the practices that you feel like you regret dropping or you're regretting not upholding, are you regretting them not being in your life because they were genuinely making you a happier person and making you a more reverent person? Were they really inspiring you? Were they actually keeping you grounded and keeping you feeling the way that you want to feel on a day-to-day basis? And are you really feeling their loss? Like, are they something that you really should be actively working towards reintegrating into your life? Or are you really just mourning a practice or a habit that was really just a form of a performance of identity? So were you, I'm not saying that you necessarily were doing those things at the time just because they made you feel a certain way, because they made you feel like you were a witch or like you were a spiritual person. But I am saying that maybe when you're looking back on those things that you were really into for a while and you're not anymore, and you're kind of thinking, oh, I really want to be doing that again. Why am I not doing that? Why can I not get myself to have that practice that I used to have? There is kind of a fine line, I think, for me anyway, between those things that, you know, that you can tell from the place you are in now, that if you were still doing them, that there is some part of you that still wants to be doing that and that would be nourished by that. And if it's really just I was such a spiritual person back then, I was such a magical person back then, I felt more witchy, I felt more spiritual, I felt, you know, like this label or identity that I have of myself was being kind of satisfied or explored or fulfilled or performed through taking that action. And if it really is just about a performance of self, a performance of identity, then that's a good time to start asking yourself, well, is that really bringing any value into my life then, apart from this kind of vague feeling of like, oh, but it makes me feel a certain way. It makes you feel not even a certain way, because feeling a certain way is a good thing. And a lot of the time we do our spiritual practices because we want to feel a certain way, but feeling like a certain kind of person. And that's kind of the fine line. And there is a very fine line there, don't get me wrong. because sometimes making ourselves feel like a certain person and performing a certain role, performing a certain identity is exactly what we need to get ourselves into that frame of mind that we're actually aiming to achieve, to get us into that sense of reverence. But yeah, I definitely realized at some stage that I needed to allow myself to release certain habits and certain practices, even if a part of me found it very, very difficult to do so, because it was very, very wrapped up in my identity as a spiritual practitioner to be doing that thing. And if I wasn't doing that thing anymore, then was I really a real X? Was I really a real pagan, you know, a real spiritual person, or whatever? So yeah, that's the first thing I would say about honesty. I'd say apart from those kind of those two basic suggestions, which are really quite vague and really quite difficult to even make sure that you're upholding them, but they're just things to maybe think about. Apart from that, I would say that another kind of fine balance that I had to find was between reinvigorating kind of old habits that I used to do, and kind of going back to my roots and letting go of things that were no longer serving me. So this is kind of still along the same lines of, is something still really nourishing you? Is a certain practice or a certain aesthetic, a certain altar type, a certain whatever it is that still something that is really calling to you, and that when you actually sit down and do it, that it makes you feel how you want to feel? Or are you actually at a point where you are holding yourself back from moving on to the next thing, or moving on to something different, or actually reinvigorating your practice by shaking it up, by just through being held on to that thing through your ego? And one of the most obvious things for me to do personally was to change up my altar. So I'll give you the example of what I ended up doing. This might be completely different for you. You might find that you need to keep the same altar and completely change your ritual structure, or introduce new poems or prayers, or, you know, there might be completely different things that you want to reintroduce into your practice. But for me, what I realized was that the altar wasn't right, and getting myself to a point where the altar does feel right. It's still a work in progress, and but that was kind of the crucial crux for me. And I find that if I'm sitting at an altar that doesn't feel quite right, that isn't reflective of where I am now, while also pulling me in the direction I want to go in, and that is really destructive for my sense of my spirituality and my practice, and, you know, for feeling satisfied with what it is that I'm doing spiritually on a day-to-day or week-by-week basis. So yeah, the first thing, now I've made a video about this before, and I'm sure I talked about this at some length, the first thing that I wanted to make sure was that my altar was actually kind of practical, and that it had things on it that weren't there just purely for aesthetic purposes, and that I wasn't just kind of dumping all of the spiritual stuff that I had accumulated over the years onto my altar in order to create an image of what in my head looks like a pagan altar, a shrine to the Morrigan, or whatever it is. And that was a big thing for me. So I wanted it to be more symbolic, more clearly symbolic, more structured. I wanted to think about what the things were that I actually wanted to represent on the altar. So it was kind of a going back to the bare bones kind of thing for me. And this is something that I've definitely advised before in the Paving Your Own Path series, when you're actually first developing your practice in the first place. And a lot of the advice that I give in that series is actually probably really suited to when you're going through a bit of a spiritual slump, because you're kind of undergoing the same process. Because I think a spiritual slump at the end of the day is a bit of a, you've stalled basically. Whatever it was that you were doing up to this point, it's not working for you anymore, and sometimes you do actually have to kind of start from scratch again, and that can be helpful. Not necessarily to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but to pick out the things that are really not working for you and just kind of start again. Start from the basics. So yeah, I made a lot of changes to my altar, and I did make a video about that, which I will endeavour to link somewhere below if it's not popping up here somewhere on the screen. I'm really bad at remembering to do that. And that was a very slow kind of gradual process. So first I had to let go of, I had made a decision to put the Morrigan shrine on my altar. I had to make a decision to let go of that, to put that in a separate part of the room, even though that made me feel uncomfortable, because I was already, my relationship with the Morrigan had already waned, and I thought, well, am I just not going to work with her anymore? But as soon as I had the altar made, I felt better. And then after a while, I realised that the central focal point of my altar was kind of making me uncomfortable, that it wasn't right. Again, I made another video about that called something about the Buddha statue on my altar, something like that, about cultural appropriation. And I realised that, yeah, that was making me feel kind of icky. Not in a major way, because, you know, I had my reasons for that being there, but it had to go as well. So the picture that you see behind me now on the altar was, you know, I really wanted to find a focal point that would be kind of simply symbolic enough for me to be a clear representation that in an instant I could look at and be reminded of something key and core to my belief system. But I wanted it to be a little bit more unique. I didn't want it to be drawing from any established religious traditions, because I'm not affiliated with any of those, you know, apart from paganism. But I mean kind of, you know, the more established traditional religions, Abrahamic, Hinduism, Buddhism, etc. So yeah, so that was, once I realised that I wanted that, I actually very quickly realised what the image was that I wanted on the altar, and I went about, you know, ordering that, and that took a while for me to actually get sorted out, but it's finally there, it's finally on my altar, and that feels comfortable to me, and it's really bringing me back to some of the advice that I gave in my Paving Your Own Path series, which was, you know, yeah, I did say, you know, play around with symbols. If a symbol is really meaningful to you that comes from another religious tradition, use it. But at the end of the day, you kind of want to be, if you are kind of creating your own spiritual practice and your own altar from scratch, it's important to you for it to be a, you know, kind of a self-expressive artwork, really, or collage might be a better word. Well, obviously a collage is an artwork. Then using symbolism or imagery that isn't kind of taken out of context sometimes can actually be really powerful. And some of the most powerful prayers and poems and stuff that I speak at the altar in sacred space are things that were not written as religious poetry or prayer. They are, you know, poems that have been written in completely different contexts and from different places. And there's something really powerful about picking up something that has spoken to you in your everyday life and bringing that to the altar. And I think that might be connected with the kind of sacred secular divide that we have constructed in our society, and how I mean, that's a whole other video actually. I don't think I'm going to be able to get into that right now. But yeah, I think in some ways religion has become kind of secularized and is associated with kind of therapeutic kind of paradigms and stuff, and that is seen to make religion kind of more just better. Like, it's better religion if it's therapeutic, if it's giving you some sort of self-help. But then on the other hand, I feel like there is this quite strict division created in our society between the religious and the secular. And this kind of serves to make the secular, i.e. kind of science and politics, to be this kind of big, immovable, real thing that we can't question. So that's a whole other ranty video that I might make at some point. So I think sometimes then it is very powerful for us to bring in things that are quote-unquote secular into our spiritual practice, because it is giving us that reminder that this spiritual thing that we're doing is not removed from our everyday lives. It's not removed from our experience as everyday citizens. It's not some weird thing that we just kind of do in the shadows that isn't accepted by society, that it is pure expression of our experience as humans. So yeah, I have found that to be really powerful. And then another thing that happened last night, just before my in-bulk ritual, was that I finally let go of the form that my Morrigan shrine was in entirely. I had created this shrine, I don't know how long ago it was actually, maybe I say so in the previous video about when I was changing up my altar. It's quite a while ago. It's like more than a year ago, I would say, maybe even 2 years, probably about 2 years ago. I created this shrine, and I was kind of mimicking a couple of different images I'd seen of different altars, and I think a part of me was trying to create what looked like an altar or a shrine to a goddess that a devotional polytheist would create. And this is where I'm talking about performance of identity and how sometimes that can be a really powerful tool, and sometimes it can actually be a bit destructive, and it leads to us feeling dissatisfied and uncomfortable in our own sacred space, which is not at all what we want to aim for. And we don't ever want to feel like we're trying to match up to something that we're not meeting, or that we're performing something that isn't authentic to us. If it's not happening in a kind of comfy way that's making us, if it's not done with intent and purpose and kind of clarity, I suppose. And yeah, I think what had happened was my relationship with the Morrigan had waned. It had rained and then it had waned. And I was trying to reinvigorate it by aping the practices of other people. So, you know, in a way it was a sort of appropriation of the practices of, like I say, devotional polytheists, which was not necessarily a terrible idea, but at the end of the day, I think, yeah, it did create an altar that I was not feeling connected with. And I moved that shrine onto a separate altar, and then I barely touched it ever since. And I realised last night, I was looking at it, I had had it covered up with a scarf for a long time because I went away, and then when I came back I never actually used it, so it was still covered up. And I took down the scarf and it was all dusty and untouched and falling to ruin. And I thought, no, there's no point in this. So I've stripped it down. I'm not going to show it on camera because I think from now on I might not show my Morrigan altar on camera, just to keep it a little bit private. Not because there's anything on it that I wouldn't want anyone to see, but just to keep a part of my practice private. But yeah, I've simplified it right down, and I've actually taken certain things off the altar again. I've just put up the things that I feel most evocative, and I'm going to see how it goes from there. And I'm going to see, and you know what, if at the end of the day I decide that I don't want a Morrigan altar right now at all, then I have to accept that that's okay. And I have to be willing to release my identity as a devotee of the Morrigan if it's just not right for me right now. And maybe it's not. I haven't been feeling called to devotion of personified deity to the extent that I used to. It just hasn't made sense to me. I have been going through a very sort of sacred cosmos kind of thing, and that has been very clear in the reinvigoration of my practice, and that's okay. So my advice to you, based on that ramble, is to do the same, to be really honest with yourself about, you know, is there something about your practice that actually is time to let go of? And it doesn't mean you have to let go of it forever, and it might come back again, but I have always been a big proponent of releasing the things from my life that are just making me feel guilt, that are making me feel bad for not doing them, to just give myself permission to not do them anymore, as long as that feels right, as long as I feel like that is more nourishing than it is damaging to me at that time. As long as I know it's not coming from a place of perfectionism or procrastination, that it's not something that I actually really, really want to be doing, but that I'm putting it off because I think it's not going to be right or perfect. I'm kind of thinking of, you know, certain creative endeavors and things like that more than spiritual practice now, things like writing and music, because those are things that have come in waves for me too, and I haven't played much music in a very long time, and allowing myself, that was a huge thing for me, about 5 years ago or more, 7 years ago maybe, was releasing my identity as a musician. And I still play a bit of music, I still pick up the guitar, I still write a few songs every now and then, I still sing a bit, but I think releasing that identity, releasing that kind of egotistical attachment to that practice was something I really needed to do so that I could move forward with other things and stop feeling guilty and stop beating myself up for being a failed musician or something, or not trying hard enough. And I think that's the crux of it really, and it's kind of life advice, not just spiritual slump advice, is you have to ask yourself, am I not doing this because I'm scared of not doing it well enough? Is it something that I actually really, really want to do, and am I avoiding it because of fear? Or is it something that I have just like lost interest in? Is it something that I am kind of trying to force myself to do because of just an old paradigm that no longer fits, and because of an old identity that is no longer me, because of old goals and dreams that actually are no longer meaningful to me. And is it time to allow myself to let go of that? Because trust me, when you let go of that, new things will come in. And you might feel as though, oh God, am I just going to sit and watch Netflix for the rest of my life? But trust me, you won't. As long as you keep open that dialogue, as long as you keep asking yourself, you know, regularly, what is it that I really want to be doing? You know, what is it that really speaks to my soul? What is it that does excite me and inspire me? And what can I do to be achieving that? What can I do to be exploring that and expressing that? And as long as you're giving yourself that kind of creative expression and that creative, I don't know, that space to kind of explore and think, as long as you're making sure that you do that, then I really do think that you will find other things to take their place. And yeah, like if I hadn't let go of my identity as a musician, I don't think I'd be here today. I don't think I would be so focused on my spirituality, actually. I wouldn't be in Edinburgh studying religious studies, which, you know, as much for all that I've struggled with that too, and not being sure if that's right for me right now, it's a huge thing. It's definitely, I definitely want to be researching religion, and it's a huge part of my life that I would never want to give up. And I'm really glad that I let go of trying to force myself to do something because it was something that I had always done, because it just wasn't for me anymore, and other things were becoming more important. And that is can be very much true of your spirituality, your spiritual practice. You know, sometimes there are just other things that are kind of quietly knocking on the door that are more important for you to be focusing on right now. And that might look completely different, and it might scare you to be letting go of those old things and those old labels and those old practices. And, you know, that's okay. And if you really just want to sit in a room with a candle lit and listen to choral, like Christian choral music, even though you were not remotely a Christian, do it, you know? At the end of the day, between you and the divine, nobody else is watching. And I think it is up to us to be authentic and to act with integrity. And we don't owe that to anyone else but ourselves. So there's no point in lying to yourself about it, and there's no point in forcing yourself to do something that isn't right for you right now. So yeah, I think that's all I'm going to say on the topic for now, and I hope that that was helpful for some of you. I definitely am turning a corner now, I think, and it's very much 2 steps forward, 1 step back in so many different avenues of my life. Hooray. I would say quarter life crisis, but I feel like I'm more like a third of life crisis at this point, or maybe even hitting my midlife crisis. I don't know. If I believed in astrology, I would say that it's my Saturn return. But just hitting me early, guys. That's, yeah, it's gonna be all fine soon. We're gonna figure it out. So yeah, I hope that was helpful, and I hope that I'll be talking to you sooner than, I know I say this every single video. I'm like, I'm gonna start making videos really regularly again, guys, and then life happens. So yeah, yeah, I will talk to you in the comments, hopefully, and I will be chatting to you again soon through another video. Thanks for watching, guys.